So this is the fourth of the talks that we're doing this week on the Bible and history, particularly the Old Testament and history. And we previously covered some introduction to sort of history and the general sort of layout and geography of the region. And then we talked about kind of the early period of the Israelite monarchy. And then yesterday we were talking about the time from the time of Ahab down to the Babylonian exile. So this one will be kind of looking at from the Babylonian exile all the way down to kind of the end of the Old Testament and just a little bit beyond that. So I've called it from exile to silence. So this is kind of what we'll be looking at. So just before we jump into it, I'll take a little bit of time just to kind of give a brief reintroduction to the world after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So quick recap. So this is a map of the empires. Sorry, beg your pardon, my voice is playing up a little bit. This is a map of the empires of the Near East around this time. So maybe around 570, 560 BC. So I'm afraid, again, sorry, I was showing you this map yesterday, but the map is in Ukrainian. It was the best map I could find of the region at the time. But you can see here Egypt, the Kingdom of Lydia, the Kingdom of Babylonia, and the large region that is ruled by the tribes of the Medes. So first one we'll have a look at is Lydia. So actually, just before jumping in, so Lydia is ruled from a place called Sardis, which is around here. And it's the smallest of the four sort of superpowers of the time, but it's quite wealthy. I don't know if any of you have ever kind of heard of the myth of King Midas. He's not actually a Lydian king, but he's from kind of a kingdom just before the Lydian Empire. And he's wealthy, of course. In the legend, everything he touches turns to gold. And so, yeah, so this is quite a wealthy sort of kingdom. If you've ever heard the phrase "rich as Croesus," this is also from a king of Lydia who was very famous for his wealth. And you can see here, kind of along the coastline here, there are a few cities. In this case, this is Ephesus, this is Miletus, and then there's a few other cities along the coast, Sinope, Trapezus, etc. And these are Greek cities. And I'd spoken before about how Greece had kind of gone into a decline at the end of the Bronze Age. Greece is now beginning to come out of this decline. They've learned how to write again, and kind of the beginnings of what we would now call Greek culture are kind of happening around this time period. So Lydia is quite unusual because it's it's not unusual. It's kind of the meeting place of the Western culture, the Greeks, which is kind of on the rise, and the older, wealthier cultures to the east, in the Middle East. So if we look, this is just outside of the city of Sardis, and you might reasonably ask, why am I showing you pictures of some random hills? It's because these aren't actually random hills. They are, they're tombs. These are vast tombs. These are the tombs of two of their nobles. This is the tomb of one of their kings, a person called Al-Yates. And you don't really need to know any of these sort of things, but it is kind of useful to just remember that these guys existed, that even the kind of the stuff that isn't talked about much in history or even in the Bible, just that this is kind of here. Unfortunately, the Kingdom of Lydia is not well talked about in history. It's historians have kind of ignored it, and the reason is that it's located in Western Turkey, and Western Turkey has a lot of other very interesting periods of history. So as a result, because there are less sources about Lydia, Lydia is kind of ignored. But you carry in your pocket memories of the Kingdom of Lydia to this day. So insofar as we can tell, the Kingdom of Lydia was the first to invent coinage. So every time you reach into your pocket for some loose change, you're kind of bearing somewhat of the memory of the Kingdom of Lydia. They are mentioned in the Bible. The book of Ezekiel talks about them a bit, but because they're a bit far away from Jerusalem or Babylon, they're not really spoken of all that much. So yeah, that's the Kingdom of Lydia. Next one we'll talk about is Egypt, and Egypt at this time is ruled from a place called Sais in the Delta region. And the pharaohs of Sais are kind of brilliant, quite fantastic. Um, they're brilliantly flawed. I think of them as history's most interesting losers. Uh, they try all sorts of interesting ideas, all of which kind of fail in various interesting ways. Um, they build a version of the Suez Canal, which doesn't work. They try and do an expedition around Africa to make a new trade route. And the expedition around Africa actually does work, but it's too long to actually be a viable trade route. One of their kings does the first scientific experiment known to man. It doesn't really work again, and the results are flawed. But these guys, what I'm basically trying to say is that Egypt at this time, it's not as wealthy or as powerful as it is in other periods, but it's a very interesting time in Egyptian history, I think at least. And then on to Babylon. Now, remember that the uh, deported Jews are probably somewhere around here. They've been deported to Babylonia in around the time 586 and the years previous. So this is the Ishtar Gate in Babylonia. Well, it's in Berlin at the moment, but this was the ornamental gate of Babylon. There were many gates, but this is the one that was most famous. And Babylon at this time is the largest city in the world. We wouldn't think of it as a very large city. It might be about 600,000 people, maybe. But compared to the population of the world at the time, that would be similar enough to a city of maybe 40 million people today. That gives you an idea of the scale of Babylon. It had huge walls, and these walls were wonders of the world. When the Greeks first talk about wonders of the world, the walls of Babylon are actually in the first list of the wonders. The Babylonians create the first world map that we know of at this point. They build the tallest of the ziggurats, the artificial mountains that they put their temples on. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may possibly be a myth, but if they did exist, they existed here and now. Basically, the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonians thought of themselves as the center of the world. That their empire was the most splendid that had ever existed. And yeah, they were extremely proud of what they'd done. You'll find some echoes of this in the book of Daniel and a few of the other sort of biblical books. But yeah, the Babylonians are extremely proud of their kingdom. Just a thing to note, actually, when looking, you're quite familiar, I'm sure, at this point with the region of Mesopotamia and the region of the Levant here that we've been talking about. But you'll notice that the Babylonian Empire actually also includes this place down here called Tema. And we know that they're very interested in this place, or one of their kings is very interested in this place. But we're not entirely sure why. It will come up in the story a little bit later. And then finally, the Kingdom of the Medes, which, as you can see, is the largest of the four superpowers. Unfortunately, I actually don't have a picture for you of the Kingdom of the Medes. We know that they're there, we know that they're very powerful, we know that they control a huge swathe of territory, but they don't really seem to build anything, they don't really seem to have any artifacts remaining. Yeah, we know that they're there. They rule their place from a city called Ekbatana around here. And then they have lots of little sub-tribes that they kind of dominate in the kind of eastern part of their kingdom. But that's really all we kind of know about the Kingdom of the Medes. So I'd like to take just a moment to mention what I sometimes call the problem of names. And the thing that we see in this particular time period when looking at the biblical sort of sources, up until this point, quite often when the Bible writes about events in history, it's people writing in Hebrew about people who also speak Hebrew with Hebrew names, okay? Now that the children of Israel have been kind of scattered somewhere down in Egypt, and most have been deported to Babylon, they're writing about people from different cultures using different languages. And honestly, there's a lot more scope for confusion here. So sometimes when we're, say, looking at the names of kings, we can kind of go, we're not quite sure who the biblical writers are actually talking about because they are using names that we might not use for those kings. But remember that we don't speak their languages either. So I mean, like quite often when we talk about kings, say for example, like say Darius or someone like that, Darius is not actually his name either. That's a Greek version of his name. So basically, what I'm saying is that particularly with the books of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, to be quite careful with the names and interpreting stuff. So just something to be aware of. So we'll have a quick look at some of the prophets who were active during the exile, specifically two prophets who were active during the exile. And the first of these is Ezekiel. So this is a quotation from Ezekiel. I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel, so hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. This is from Ezekiel 33. So this shows, this is an illustration of one of the most famous visions from the book of Ezekiel. It's the vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones. And Ezekiel was actually deported to Babylonia before the fall of Jerusalem. So himself and a number of other sort of probably high-ranking enough deportees were taken over to Babylon. And they later hear that Judah, that Jerusalem is once again in revolt against the Babylonians. So many of the exiles are really hoping that Jerusalem will actually beat the Babylonians, that there'll be some miracle to save Jerusalem like there was in the days of Sennacherib. And one of the things Ezekiel actually does is he actually counsels them, the exiles, to not hope for this, that Jerusalem will fall. But that there is still hope and that there will be a return, but that it won't be an immediate return like they're all hoping for. So it's kind of trying to inspire a genuine and a real hope, but a hope that's slightly further in the future than the people are kind of looking for. The other prophet who's active at this time is Daniel, and he lives a very different life to Ezekiel. Daniel is brought over to Babylon when he's quite young. He is trained up as a Babylonian administrator and rises to a very high position within the Babylonian aristocracy. Which, by the way, is kind of, it's useful to remember that the Jews in Babylon were not slaves. They were exiles, but they were not slaves. And that some of them did actually do quite well for themselves, Daniel included. So Daniel, if you read the book of Daniel, the first part of it describes the life of Daniel and others who are deported with him. And the second half of it is talking about prophecies for the future. So when you read it, just be aware that kind of, I think around chapter 7, that the tone shifts between the two parts of the book. So I'm not going to talk too much about the time of the Babylonian exile, but there is one little moment in the Babylonian exile that I'd like to kind of highlight. In the year Marduk became king of Babylon, on the 25th day of the 12th month, he released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and freed him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king of Babylon gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance till the day of his death. Sorry, a regular allowance as long as he lived till the day of his death. This is kind of from near enough the end of Jeremiah. And remember how I was mentioning at the beginning of the first lecture how we shouldn't really talk about how we shouldn't expect exact confirmation of every statement in the Bible. The thing is, sometimes we do actually find exact confirmation of statements in the Bible. So here you can see day by day the king of Babylon gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance. We actually have that regular allowance. So here's a receipt for Jehoiakim's rations. In this case, the rations of olive oil that he's actually allowed to have. So if you're in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, you can actually see this. And this is the thing, the sila is kind of a measure that they use for olive oil. 10 sila to Ayakuinu, the king of Judah's son, and then some more sila for the 5 sons of the Judean king. So it's, I don't know, like it's a very minor sort of point, but I do think it's just kind of wonderful to go and see occasional confirmations, exact confirmations of stuff that is mentioned in the Bible. So we'll move on from sort of the Neo-Babylonian Empire to kind of the end of this empire. And while the Babylonian Empire is very, like, while it lasts, it is spectacular, it does not last long. So the person who takes it down is a person called Cyrus. Cyrus he's a minor king of a minor tribe that would be subject to the Medes. His tribe is called the Persians. They're a subordinate tribe, but they're kind of related to the Medes. They speak a very similar language. They worship similar gods, and they live not that far away from them. Cyrus is, we think this is a depiction of someone. Obviously, we don't think Cyrus had wings, but we think that this is possibly a representation of Cyrus. This is a modern reproduction of an older representation. So basically, Cyrus kind of comes to power in a rather unusual way. He is related to the King of the Medes, but the King of the Medes is unpopular. Cyrus revolts against the king, and all the supporters of the Median king switch over to support Cyrus. So Cyrus basically, without really doing a whole pile of fighting, ends up kind of with the small tribe swallowing the much larger kingdom. And he does this by basically promising that the nobles of the Medes will be well treated, and that the Medes will be effectively treated the same as the Persians. So kind of, you'll notice in the Bible that quite often there'll be the phrase Medes and the Persians. That's because kind of when Cyrus comes to power, he does so by basically merging the two sort of political entities. Then Cyrus is attacked by Lydia, one of the other sort of 4 superpowers, and Cyrus goes and is able to go and fight back and conquer Lydia. And he does so in a rather unusual fashion. Again, he's quite skillful at everything he does, but even people who are talking about Cyrus from different cultures, like the Greeks, they almost talk about Cyrus as if there's something very special about Cyrus. Something he's stuff kind of works out well for Cyrus. For example, he's able to take the kingdom of Lydia because someone drops their helmet in the wrong place. It's an unusual story. Long and the short of it is that Cyrus has now taken over, of the 2 superpowers, he's taken over 2 of them. And considering that Babylon was allied to both the king of the Medes and the king of Lydia, war with Babylon is kind of inevitable. So fairly shortly thereafter, Cyrus goes to war with Babylon. Now, the Babylonians aren't too worried with this, but the Babylonian Empire is not united at the same time. Their last king is a person called Nabonidus, and Nabonidus decides, for some reason, to go off to that desert, that oasis that I was pointing out in the southern desert. And we're not sure why. He disappears there for 10 years. The Babylonian priests are furious at him. They hate that the king of Babylon has left Babylon. We have no idea why he goes out there, but he leaves his son, a person called Belshazzar, who's known in the Bible as Belshazzar. He leaves his son as deputy. His son is very unpopular, and Nabonidus is very unpopular. The priests do not like these guys. So the Persian army attacks Babylonia. Nabonidus returns to Babylon, but doesn't actually go into the city. He hides in a nearby city. The Babylonian army is defeated at a place called Upu, and the Persian army is able to kind of bypass these huge walls that have been built by Nebuchadnezzar to keep people out. But the Babylonians are still not worried. Like, okay, they may have bypassed the outer walls, but the walls of Babylon are still strong. The Persians are still outside the walls. There is no reason to be afraid. And the Bible actually records that there is a great feast on the sort of, even though the Persian army is outside, the Babylonians are so confident that they have a great feast. The Greeks actually also mention this. So according to the book of Daniel, which is shown here, writing appears on the walls, and Daniel, who at this point is quite elderly, interprets this, that basically the kingdom of Babylon will fall to the Persians. And this is Belshazzar, because Belshazzar is the regent. He's still reigning as king in Babylon because his father is in Borsippa. And yeah, basically the prophecy comes true pretty much that very night, either through treachery or by doing something with the river gates. The Persian army is able to sneak into the city. The Greeks actually talk about that the city is so large that people at one end of the city have no idea the city is taken, even while it's taken, that type of thing. But now the long and the short of it is that Belshazzar is killed, Nabonidus is now no longer king, and Cyrus is now king of 3 of the superpowers. In fact, he's now king of the largest empire that has yet existed on this earth, up until that point. And Cyrus was not, he's the greatest conqueror at this point the world has known. But he has no experience in ruling empires of this size. No one in his entourage has any experience of ruling empires this size. Even the median aristocracy they're not administrators. So they have no idea how to kind of rule this vast empire that they now find themselves in charge of. So imagine they now rule all of this, all of the green, all of the yellow, all of the blue, all of the red. So I think that's blue. Whatever they rule basically all of this. Yeah. So one of the ways that they kind of deal with this is by effectively, they don't exactly know how to rule, so they don't. If someone wants to do something that doesn't actually threaten the empire, they basically allow them to do it. So the Babylonian priests are very annoyed at what Nabonidus has done over his reign, so they want to reverse all his changes. And Cyrus says, yeah, fine, that's grand, you do that. And obviously the Jewish exiles who had been exiled by the Babylonians want to return, and Cyrus is basically saying, yes, yeah, go for it. Cyrus actually appears to be quite a decent person. The kings of Lydia and Babylon might even be allowed to live. We're not 100% sure, but it's possible that both Croesus and Nabonidus are spared by Cyrus. But when you're looking at this, if you're doing your own research, just be careful when looking at documents about Cyrus, because there's a modern forgery from Iran from 1950, basically sort of talking about how Cyrus made the first Charter of Human Rights, how he freed every slave in the empire, and so on. This isn't true. This is a modern forgery. Cyrus, by all accounts, was a very decent, very respectable guy. The Greeks, the Babylonians, the Hebrews all really like Cyrus. But his ideas of right and wrong are not our modern ideas of right and wrong. So just to keep an eye out for that forgery. Cyrus gives an edict for basically allowing anyone who wants to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. They have full permission to do so. In fact, he even gives them the stuff that was looted from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. All of that is allowed to basically be returned. He basically says everyone should try and help the restoration. So the Bible quotes this. This is from Ezra. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. So we've covered basically the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Does anyone have any questions?
David, I was wondering if those bright blue gates were really that bright blue at the time of Babylon?
Yeah, they were. The Babylonians really love this particular bright blue gemstone called lapis lazuli, and they basically try, and all their nice ornamental buildings, they try and match that same sort of kind of electric blue color.
David, can you give us an example of the differences between Cyrus's idea versus our modern day right and wrong?
Sorry, the audio kind of cut there for a little bit. Were you saying examples of differences between Cyrus's ideas of right and wrong and modern day right and wrong?
Correct.
Okay, well, yeah, the most obvious example would be slavery. Slavery was pretty much endemic in the ancient world, and pretty much every ancient culture would have actually been okay with slavery. Cyrus was okay with slavery as well. We nowadays would look at slavery and say it was absolutely wrong, but Cyrus would not. It's something that we just, it's an unfortunate fact of history that up until maybe about 200 years ago, most people in the world were actually okay with slavery. There'd be plenty of other examples as well. I suppose like the Persians have a reputation for being tolerant in modern day, but like when in the ancient world, if a city falls by siege, basically anyone inside the city can be kind of killed. Nowadays, we would view this as a war crime, but in those days, that was just how warfare was conducted. So we know that Cyrus does kill people. Like he's a generous conqueror, but he's still a conqueror. He kills a lot of people. If someone was to do what he did nowadays, we might call him a war criminal.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's important. It's something that we maybe lose sight of sometimes looking back at history. Just the idea that a lot of what we sort of take for granted is not always there in history, and particularly, yeah, a lot of ideas of morality don't necessarily translate back. It's quite a difficult sort of thing to kind of bear in mind, but yeah, it is something we just need to keep in mind. Is there anything else? Okay, well, might just head onwards then. So the next sort of period that we're going to kind of look at is the period of basically the exiles returning. So the fall of Babylon is around 539 BC. So the exiles return and they find the Samaritans. So basically, the Samaritans are these are a group of people. They still exist today, by the way. This is a picture of some Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. They were the remaining Jews who had been left in the land, mostly in the north of the land, who had assimilated with settlers who'd been brought in by the Assyrians earlier on. And they do practice some form of Judaism, but it's likely to be a form of Judaism that had at least some worship of other gods. So they do worship the God of Israel, but they worship him in a way that is not quite in the customs of the law, and that they also worship other gods at the same time. We're not sure exactly of how much they do. Honestly, this is something I'm not very familiar with, and I'm not sure that any scholar is all that familiar with it. We know they practice some type of polytheism, but they're also, yeah, it's complicated, basically. So when the Jewish exiles return from Babylon, they find these people already in the land, and they're already quite organized. And they're not happy to see people coming back from Babylon and trying to rebuild Jerusalem. This kind of upsets the balance in the region, if that makes sense, and they're not happy with that. So as a result, after the death of Cyrus, and this shows the tomb of Cyrus in Iran, after the death of Cyrus, the people who live around Jerusalem lodged complaints to the new king, a person called Cambyses, who's the son of Cyrus. And they lodged complaints to Cambyses, and Cambyses basically says, yeah, you're not allowed to build the temple, just cease everything, just stop what you're doing. And as a result, work on the kind of reconstruction kind of ceases. And yeah, around this time, it's not actually mentioned in the Bible, but it gives a little bit of a picture of what happens next. Cambyses of Persia goes through the region and conquers Egypt. So now the Persian Empire control all four of the superpowers, as it were. Just as a little interesting aside, we're not 100% sure how Cyrus dies. So even though he's the most powerful man in the world, all we have is this kind of Greek fairy tale as to how he died. And the Greek fairy tale might be true, but I'm very skeptical about it. So Around the year 520, the temple is rebuilt. So what happens in the Persian Empire to allow the administration to change their mind from you're not allowed to build to you're allowed to build? And it seems to be partly to do with a civil war. So this is it's a really weird story, to be honest. I've heard about it. It's kind of a 2,544-year-old murder mystery. So I'm surprised no one has made a film of this, to be honest. It's the most audacious coup in the history of the world. Cambyses is the king of Persia. He is campaigning in Egypt, and he's been worried that his brother Bardia will take the throne. So he secretly orders that his brother Bardia is to be murdered, and so that this is to be kept hidden from people, because you don't want to be the king who goes around murdering their brothers. So Bardia is dead, and not many people know this, except for one person who does know it, is someone who happens to be a doppelganger of Bardia, someone who looks exactly like Bardia. And when Cambyses is off campaigning in Egypt, Bardia, or this fake Bardia, pretends to be the prince, pretends to launch a revolution, and basically takes over the throne of Persia. Cambyses is furious to find out that the brother he murdered to stop becoming king has become king anyway. Goes back, tries to return to Persia in a rage, dies on his way back, and now the doppelganger is now king. It's a bizarre story. Then 7 nobles figure out that this person is not actually the king, and they launch a plot, and 7 of them, the highest ranking nobles in the Persian Empire, just walk into the palace, hoping that no one will stop them, and murder the doppelganger. They declare one of their number to be king, a fellow called Darius, and unfortunately, fake Bardia was really popular because he'd cancelled all the taxes, so the entire empire rises up against Darius, and Darius then has to go and fight for a year and a half to try and restore the empire. So here you can see Darius, here's fake Bardia, and here's the kings of all the people who rebelled against him. It's a bizarre story, and a lot of people think that Darius is actually lying, that Bardia wasn't fake Bardia, that he was just real Bardia, and that Darius just killed him and then pretended that he'd been an imposter the whole time. Either way, no matter who's telling the truth and who's lying, this is the most audacious coup in history. So it's not really, it's a little bit kind of to the side of what we're talking about, but I thought it was a good enough story that I thought I'd be worth telling. As I say, 2,544-year-old murder mystery. Sorry, 42-year-old, I beg your pardon. After all the chaos of this time, the Jews in Jerusalem decide that they're going to rebuild the temple, and they ask Darius if they can have permission to do this. And Darius agrees, presumably because he's delighted that someone isn't rebelling against him and is just asking him for something. So Zerubbabel, who is leading the community at this point, rebuilds the temple. And the temple is, so this is a huge boost for the Jews. And the temple that is rebuilt is on a much smaller scale. In fact, the Bible records that anyone who could remember the old temple cried when they saw the new temple because it was so small. But even so, this is a huge turning point in the history of the returning exiles. Helping to support the rebuilding of the temple are 2 prophets by the name of Haggai and Zechariah, and their writings are in the Minor Prophets section of the Old Testament. I couldn't find any good picture of Haggai and Zechariah, so I just put in some picture of Persian buildings. But yeah, so the context of Haggai and Zechariah are around this time. They're both written, I think, in the year 520. So we'll just take a little bit of time just to kind of backtrack and talk about the big picture stuff that's happening in Persia before going back and looking at what happens in the region around Judah. So around the years 490 to 480, there is a war with Greece. Do you remember I was talking about the Kingdom of Lydia and how there were Greek city-states along the coastline? When the Persians conquer Lydia, they also take over those little cities. And around the year 500, those cities rise up in revolt. It's not a very serious war. It's one of these sort of very minor things, but they accidentally burn Sardis. And the Persians are very annoyed about this. and they're particularly annoyed about the fact that some Greeks from mainland Greece have helped the rebellion, particularly from a little city called Athens. And the Persians send a small expedition to go and deal with the Athenians, and the Athenians are able to beat back the small expedition at a place called Marathon. And anyway, so the Persian kings up to this point have all been great conquerors. So Cyrus has conquered much of the known world. Cambyses has conquered Egypt. Darius has conquered what we would now call Pakistan and what we would now call Bulgaria. And his son Xerxes wants to conquer something as well. So he chooses Greece. He's going to launch a huge expedition. He's going to attack an overwhelming force, and he will crush the Greeks who have defeated this small force. So he attacks an overwhelming force, and contrary to everyone's expectations, including the Greeks win. The Persians suffer a major defeat and have to retreat. King Xerxes has to flee back to Persia. And I don't know if people are kind of familiar with the film 300, which is not a very good film, but it's kind of the events of 300 are loosely based on this war. So anyway, it doesn't directly, it is referred to in one or two places in the Bible. Some people think that the opening chapter of the book of Esther is referring to a planning meeting for this invasion, but it's a little bit conjectural. But the important thing to know is that for the first time, Persia has been shown to not be invincible, that the Persian Empire has limits and that they can be beaten. And after this, the Persians don't really win any great victories. They can win battles here and there, and their empire is still the largest and the wealthiest in the world, but they're not winning anymore. And from now on, they're kind of locked in these sort of little battles with sort of the Greek city-states, particularly Athens, who the Athenians are kind of attacking the edges of Persia. They're not powerful enough to get far in, they're not powerful enough to really damage the empire, but no longer is Persia invincible. And this is kind of a bit of a turning point. So as I was mentioning, the invasion of Greece is kind of, some people tie it into the book of Esther. Esther is one of the wives of Xerxes, or again, we think she's one of the wives of Xerxes. There are some issues with the names. So it's, the Hebrew in the book of Esther talks about the king Ahasuerus. It's not clear if Ahasuerus, if the Hebrew word Ahasuerus is the same as the Greek word Xerxes, if that makes sense. And there are actually three kings called Xerxes as well, so it's not clear which Xerxes it would be as well. Most people think that it's this Xerxes the First, son of Darius. Esther is able to use her position to go and to foil a plot from one of the high-ranking royal officials to destroy the Jews, and basically the Jewish people is kind of saved through basically God working through Esther in this case. Something kind of like a very broad sort of picture sort of thing, we should think of the Persian Empire as kind of beginning to decline around this point. They still build fantastic buildings, they're still incredibly wealthy, but they're just, up to this point, the Persian Empire is quite liked by its subjects. After this point, they're not really liked, and they're still impressive, but they're just, there's no vitality to them at all. This actually shows one of the this is the top of one of the columns of one of their pillars. So it's in the Louvre. This is a person there for scale. These things are huge. Like this, as I say, the Persians still built spectacularly, but they didn't really do anything else at this point. And they only built spectacularly in the center of their kingdom. What they would do is they would tax everyone, particularly the outlying regions, and that money would go into the center and it would be melted down and it would never leave. So the Persian kings grew fabulously wealthy, but the outer edges of their empire became ever more drained of anything. Everything was taken in, nothing went out. So as a side note, by the way, this column, the column head, is taken from the palace at Susa. So it's quite possible that these bulls one day stared down on Esther and later on would have stared down on Nehemiah. So if those walls could talk, So Again, what I'm kind of talking about with the sort of growing military weakness of Persia and the taxation policies, Egypt, which really doesn't like being ruled by non-Egyptians, Egypt becomes very restless under Persian rule, and again, the Egyptians revolt. And the Persians are usually able to crush these revolts, but every time they crush the revolts, they have to be more and more bloody, and every time they do so, they generate more and more resentment. So elsewhere in the empire, the Persians are disliked. In Egypt, the Persians are hated. And quite often when the Egyptians do rise up, they'll call in the Greeks, particularly the Athenians, and the Persians really find it difficult to go and hold on to Egypt. So it's kind of in this context of kind of an empire that's still strong, but kind of slowly going downhill. This is the context of the second return, which is in and around 464 BC, give or take. Some scholars have slightly different ideas for the dates here, but 464 is the general consensus. This is from Nehemiah. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. So basically, the city of Jerusalem had never been fully restored from the time of its destruction in 586 by the Babylonians. The temple has been rebuilt on a smaller scale, but it is rebuilt. But most people aren't actually living in Jerusalem. They're living in these little fortified villages kind of in and around the city. The city itself is kind of too dangerous to live in. If too many people live there, it will become a target for bandits, and it's not considered safe. So two people in particular go and help the community. The first is Ezra, and Ezra returns. He brings some people with him. He revitalizes the community. He helps organize them, and he helps interpret basically the law for them. So Ezra is quite pivotal in terms of sort of both the reorganization of the sort of the actual community itself, but also the spiritual revitalization of this community. And Nehemiah his mission is kind of overlapping but complementary with Ezra's. Nehemiah is sent out as governor. He actually goes out twice. He goes out, he does some stuff, he returns, he goes back again. He rebuilds the walls and he restores much of Jerusalem. In fact, he kind of incentivizes it for people to return from the countryside into the city to make the city a city again. And some people think that the Persians are encouraging Nehemiah to do this because they're worried that Egypt is in revolt. This is very conjectural. I wouldn't sort of, it's possible, it's hard to know. It's hard to know to what extent the revolts in Egypt have anything to do with what's happening in Jerusalem, but it's not impossible. So let's talk a little bit about the other Jews, the other groups which would be sort of part of sort of the broad sort of cultural practices of Judaism. And the first would be the Samaritans, the people we were talking about earlier, the ones who had been concerned about the community returning from Babylon. And these guys are still a problem for the guys in Jerusalem. When Nehemiah tries to rebuild the walls, they basically try and disrupt the building as much as possible. And at one point, they actually seem to be trying to murder the governor, Nehemiah. Now, you might actually be thinking, this is really weird because the people who are trying to murder the Persian governor, because Nehemiah is a governor for the Persian Empire, the people who are trying to murder this guy are also Persian governors. Like, surely this is insane. But in actual fact, the Persian Empire was quite loose about what it allowed and what it didn't allow. They were actually okay with different governors going to war against each other, just as long as no one actually rebelled against the central authority. So in some ways, they were actually happy when the provincial governors hated each other, because it meant that they weren't likely to join together and revolt against the Persians. It's a weird system, but there you go. Also around this time, there was the Elephantine papyri. So I remember, you remember I was talking about how papyrus disintegrates in wet climates. In Egypt, if you're away from the River Nile, it's a very dry climate. It very seldom rains. And when it does, it's very quickly dried up again. And so if something is kind of undercover, it's actually quite likely to survive. We are fortunate enough to have a bunch of letters from a city called Elephantine in the south of Egypt. And there's a Jewish community down here, possibly part of a Persian garrison, possibly related to the Jews who have fled down to Egypt in the time of Jeremiah. And their letters are quite fascinating, to be honest, but they're a little difficult to interpret. They show that these guys are still practicing a type of polytheism. They worship the God of Israel, but they also worship other gods as well. But they celebrate the Passover. There's a lot of stuff that is very similar, but slightly. It's hard to fully understand exactly how they worship God, but it does seem to be kind of a hangover from the polytheistic ways of the earlier Jewish kingdom. So they do have some ties to the community in Jerusalem. They write to the high priest in Jerusalem, but I'm not sure if they actually get a reply. They also have dealings with the Samaritans, and they write to the Samaritans, and they seem to get on better with the Samaritans. So that probably makes sense, considering that the Samaritans are slightly polytheistic, and these guys are definitely polytheistic. So it's just it's interesting to know that these guys are out there as well. That the community in Jerusalem is not the only people who are calling themselves Jews at this time. This community does not last. It disappears around the year 400. They just disappear from history, and we're not sure what happens to them. But the majority of Jews at this point are probably not in Elephantine in Egypt, not in Samaria, not in Jerusalem. The majority of them are probably in Babylon at this point. And it's something we tend to forget sometimes, is that basically Mesopotamia was actually a very important center of Judaism up until maybe about 150 years ago. And yeah, so like later on, when the Talmud is being compiled, a lot of that work is done actually outside of Babylon. So the community in Jerusalem is able to be kind of supported financially and spiritually by the community that's still very strong, very prosperous in Babylonia. Like it's no mistake that people like Ezra and Nehemiah are actually coming out to Judah from that sort of region. So we're now kind of into the sort of the last sections of the Old Testament, and I've put in the sort of the dates of 464 to 336. It's not so much that the prophets are kind of still talking in 336. Most people put the end of prophecy in around the year 400, but I've put in 336 because this is kind of, I'll talk up to the point of 336, if that makes sense. Just didn't want, I've probably introduced more confusion with that than, yeah. The last prophet in the Old Testament is a person called Malachi, who writes the book that bears his name. And this is not Malachi, this is a Persian coin. This is, do you remember I was talking about how the Persians would tax the outlying provinces and take all that money in and then melt it down? Basically, they were looking for these type of coins to basically just be sent inland to the heartland of their empire. And we can see, even by the time of Nehemiah, if you read the book of Nehemiah again, you'll notice that towards the end of his time as governor, the land is getting very poor. People are selling themselves into slavery on a regular basis. He has to kind of stop people selling themselves into slavery. And it's this kind of context of growing poverty, which seems to be, by the way, widespread throughout the empire. It's this growing poverty that Malachi is talking about, and talking about the importance of basically still being faithful to God and still maintaining faithfulness even in difficult economic times. So that's kind of some of the context for the book of Malachi. So after Nehemiah is sort of governor of Jerusalem, other successors follow him. Some of their names are preserved in the book of Nehemiah itself. By and large, the Persians allow the Jews a lot of leeway in choosing their own governors. There is one time where the Persians intervene because one governor murders the high priest or something like that. the sources are a bit confused at this point. But by and large, they're allowed to govern themselves. They're small, they're insignificant, they're poor. They're allowed to just handle their own affairs. Later Jewish tradition talks about a group of people called the Great Assembly, and they would be kind of a forerunner of what would go on to become the Sanhedrin in the time of the New Testament. I'm not 100% sure that this group of people ever actually existed. According to later Jewish tradition, they're involved in collating the works of the prophets, forming the oral tradition of Judaism. I'm really not sure that this group ever existed, or if they did, that they were a formal body. But I thought it was maybe worth mentioning. And the reason for it is that we just don't have many sources for this time period. Even the Greek sources, which are our best sources of this time, don't really tell us much. It's an irony of history that the Persian Empire, which I've talked about extensively throughout this, it's the largest empire in the world at this time. And we know that they keep records. In fact, the records are actually mentioned in the Book of Esther. But those records don't survive to us. The Persian Empire is described exclusively in the words of its subject peoples or its enemies. We don't know how they spoke about themselves. So for the later periods of the Persian Empire, we just don't know much about them. So this does change in around the sort of year 346, I think. But that changes, we'll look at that in the next sort of section. So this is kind of where the Old Testament ends. The Old Testament ends in around the year 400 BC. And for the next few decades, there's really not much more that can be said. So I figured that this silence is probably not the best, or not the worst place to kind of leave it. For the next talk, we'll be looking at the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But for now, all I can leave you with is silence and the map of the Persian Empire. So this is the map of the Persian Empire around the time of 500 BC. And this kind of shows, yeah, so they would have lost Egypt around this time. They've lost this region around this time. They're still impressive, but it's a kingdom that's kind of going slowly downhill. So are there any questions?
Thanks so much, David. I have a quick question. I was wondering, what was the Greek myth about Cyrus's death? You said you find it hard to believe. I'm interested. What is the story behind his death? They have.
Okay. Let's see if I can give this justice. He picks a fight with a queen in Central Asia and of a people called the Masagitai. And he picks a fight with her, and he's worried that his soldiers aren't good enough to beat her. So he makes a trap where he retreats and leaves out a bunch of wine. And the Masagitai get drunk, and he attacks them while they're drinking and kills her son. And the queen is so annoyed about this that she goes and chases Cyrus down and kills him and drops his head in a wineskin and goes, you know, fills the wineskin full of blood and then drops his head in a wineskin and so goes, I hope you've drunk your fill. It's a weird story, but you asked.
Brilliant. Thanks. Very good.
Herodotus tells it a wee bit better than I did, but you know, that's the short version.
Just a quick question. You were saying that Darius conquered what's now Bulgaria. What was the other country that you know, that he conquered?
He kind of pushes in two directions. He attacks a group of people called the Scythians in what would now be kind of Romania and Ukraine. And so he kind of builds a bridge of boats to get from Asia into Europe. So he crosses in and around what would now be Istanbul. And so he conquers Bulgaria and then sort of goes up chasing the Scythians. He doesn't catch them, retreats back. And then he goes and sends his armies eastwards and conquers around the Indus Valley in what would nowadays be Pakistan.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't know a whole pile about that expedition, but in fact, the very word India actually comes from that expedition. That's where we actually get our word for India. It's a corruption of a Persian, and it's a corruption of a Persian word for rivers, I think. Yeah, so yeah, there's quite a, like, it's, in a way, it's quite difficult to try and talk about something like this just in the course of an hour or so, because there's so many stories, so many, like, this is a very, like, people could spend like years studying this period of history, and many people have. It's quite a lot to kind of take in all at once. So just like, if there's some stuff that maybe isn't making a whole pile of sense, like, don't worry too much about it. Like, there's kind of a lot of ground covered on this one. So yeah, if people are happy, we might maybe try and wrap it up there. Tomorrow we'll be kind of looking at the time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So stuff that isn't actually referenced in the Bible. So some parts of it are referred to sort of obliquely in books of prophecy, but it's not explicitly mentioned in the books of the Old Testament. But I think it's kind of useful to, I think if we kind of just left the story there, it would be a little difficult to kind of see how things are at the time of Jesus. So I think maybe just some sort of idea of what happens over the next 350 years might try and shed a bit of light. So that's hopefully what we'll do on Friday, if that works for people. So yeah, might just leave it there then.
Thanks very much, David. I took plenty of notes again. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you.